The stalking started out lightly enough. I noticed a customer in the shoe store I work in that did more wandering around the store than actually looking at the product. After a while, I finally confronted the guy. I almost immediately recognized him as a weird, kind of nerdy kid I'd had a few classes with in high school, but didn't say anything as I didn't have any real exchanges with him. I searched my brain for his name and remembered that it was Kyle. His face brightened up at my approach, and I assumed he was glad to have an employee offer help. I asked him if there was anything I could help him with. He continued to smile and almost seem long-tied. The exchange didn't become uncomfortable, however, until he answered my questions with, "You're just always so beautiful," and reached to touch my hair. I flinched back, which didn't seem to deter him much as he continued to try to touch it. Gratefully, a coworker saw my clear discomfort and intervened. I was able to slip away to the safety of the back room, but it didn't deter him from staying in the store long enough to cause security to escort him out. From there, it was every single day. He was at my work, wandering around, asking other employees if I was on schedule that day and if he could speak to me. He'd often refer to me as his girlfriend. He wrote notes, too, to be given to me. In them, he told me that his obsession ran back to high school, but didn't manifest until he'd come into my work at random and saw me for the first time in a few years. It changed everything about his life, and he said that he always imagined us together. It only got worse when he was banned from the mall the store resided in altogether. I hoped so deeply that this was enough to make him go away. However, when I returned to my car at close, I found roses and a photo of me getting into my car the night before with "See you at home" written in red Sharpie. I began to panic, frantically glancing around the parking lot, before realizing that the note likely meant that Kyle probably knew where I lived, and could even be there already. I finally called the police, too afraid to even go in the direction of home before being entirely sure it was safe. Sure enough, the dispatch officers found my lock picked. A trail of rose petals led from the door into my bedroom. He had gone through my clothes, picked out a dress and a set of lingerie, and laid them out on the bed. Additionally, there was a fabric baggie with a few small bones, some twigs, and a red feather tucked under my pillow. There was no note this time, but the message was clear enough for me. Despite the obviousness of the situation, the police would not pull charges against Kyle. The absence of a handwritten note couldn't 100% connect his stalking to the break-in. Helplessness washed over me, and I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't live alone anymore. I had an extra room, and one of my co-workers, Adrian, had recently been abandoned by her roommates. This was supposed to make me feel safe, and maybe even scare off my stalker. But again, it didn't deter him at all. He knew that breaking in was risky, but he'd still leave things in the mailbox, my car, things buried in the yard, just anywhere he knew I'd find it, really. There were a lot more of those little fabric baggies with weird items inside. A friend once joked that it was witchcraft, but I didn't find that at all funny. During this time, he drove past my house 20 to 30 times a day. This is not illegal, so the police did nothing, even when he clearly parked across the street and watched me from his car. Obviously, Kyle misunderstood my roommate's situation, became jealous, and began threatening Adrian. These were much darker and more violent. There was a point where Adrian's mother called him in tears. Someone had killed their outdoor cat and left it in an unspeakable position on the hood of her van. I was later sent photos of what barely resembled a cat, baking in the hot sun on the hood of a car. Black paint circled the gore, and there were 4 weird, barely legible symbols painted in what I can only assume was cat blood. Again, the police could not prove that it was Kyle, so they did nothing aside from advising that the car not be drove until a mechanic could confirm that it had not been tampered with. Adrian quit his job and moved in with his mother. I couldn't stand being alone, so I had no choice but to break my lease and move back home with my own parents. I haven't spoken to Adrian since, and he began actively avoiding me. I didn't blame him. I was fucking terrified for myself and everyone around me. Kyle already knew where my parents lived. The day after move-in, I woke up to more roses on my car hood and 2 large gift boxes stuffed in my back seat. I sighed, checked the car for weird bags, found one tucked under the hood and tossed it in the trash. Soon this became the routine, throwing shit in the trash, constantly checking over my shoulder. Anyone close to me became too threatened to stick around. My constant rejection only made Kyle's weird gifts more violent. Roses, chocolates, and presents became dead strays. Animal blood smeared onto my car or the house, and threatening notes. In these notes, he continued to state that he was giving me chances to come on my own, but was losing his patience, and promised me that he had a foolproof way to make me his. But I wouldn't like it. It'll be painful, trust me, he'll make it hurt. He often referred to another man in these letters, but only when giving these ultimatums. There were a few closer encounters. He'd wait until I was in a crowded public place, at least alone enough that he could get in close proximity without being recognized. Once I noticed him, he knew his time was limited, and would speedily begin proclaiming his love for me and begging me to be with him. Between insults and cursing, mind you, before running off to avoid being caught. By this time, the police had done absolutely nothing for me, but once hearing my story, most public places and shops were more than willing to give me any security camera footage that contained the exchanges in hopes that I could use it for future charges. By this time, Kyle had been stalking me for nearly a year. I spent every single day in fear, but I was starting to feel like I had everything I needed to finally get him. All it would really take was a definite step over the line of the law of justice. Just once. However, just when it seemed like karma might finally bite him, everything stopped. No weird little baggies, no gifts or threatening letters. I didn't immediately feel hopeful. I didn't normally see him every single day before. He always at least took one day off, but after 2 weeks of absolutely nothing, I was ready to believe he might have given up. This was not the case, and I was only informed of this fact by being knocked out from behind while trying to get into my car after work. I don't remember falling forward and striking my face on the top of the car door. I don't remember collapsing. I do remember, in a split moment, thinking to myself, I knew he didn't go anywhere. I came to consciousness for a few moments in the trunk of my own car, but couldn't keep awake. I didn't snap out of it until hours later. My vision was blurry and dark, and I tried to move my arms and legs, only to find them bound with something plastic and far too tight. Zip ties. They were pressing much too hard into my wrists, and I stopped moving entirely to minimize the pain. Blinking a little more, my vision finally started to come back, and I began taking in my surroundings. I was laying on my side on a metal-framed bed with white and pink floral sheets. The room was otherwise bare of furniture besides an old, shadeless lamp placed in the center of the floor. The windows were covered with black trash bags. I listened for movement outside of the room, but heard none. For what felt like hours, I laid there in silence, afraid to move and knowing that there was absolutely no way I could escape with my ankles bound. Kyle finally entered the room, carrying a very full-looking backpack. "Oh good, you're awake. It's required that you're awake for this." My mouth wasn't covered, but I didn't dare say anything. He saw the fear on my face but was unsympathetic. "Don't look at me like that. You should have listened. You brought this upon yourself." Kyle sat the backpack down on the floor and began unloading the items inside. He pulled out an empty mason jar, a large ziplock of black powder of some sort, another Ziploc with some kind of animal gore inside, 4 varying sized blades, and a tiny green book. I thought back to every creepy little fabric baggie, to every threatening and ritualistic usage of dead animals and blood, and suddenly wondered why I had barely thought of it, even deemed it as nothing more than fear tactic. He started pouring the black powder into a large circle, the lamp in the center, which he then proceeded to empty the gore next to. It smelled horribly of rot and copper. I had to fight my gag reflex. He then grabbed the smallest of the 4 knives and fear began to well up worse than ever before. I couldn't keep quiet anymore and started pleading for him to let me go. I cried and told him I'd never tell anyone. He just chuckled. Give it up. If you really meant that, you would have let me love you in the first place. You wouldn't have made it come to this. He said this while pointing the knife at me and I shut my mouth. Kyle then grabbed the jar, opened it, and sat down with it and the knife in the center of the room. He cut into the palm of his hand and began allowing the blood to flow into the jar. He didn't need much before he was satisfied, and began using the blood to create another very thin, concentric circle inside the black powder, right around the lamp and gore. He dumped the rest onto the crude pile of animal gore. Then Kyle reached his hand into the jar, wiped up the caked blood inside with his hand, and proceeded to smear it all over his face. With his other hand covered in blood, he approached me and covered my face as well. It had cooled and started to become sticky, and the overwhelming smell of it started to make me nauseous again. He turned away wordlessly and snatched the green book from the floor. He opened directly to a page he had bookmarked with a similar red feather to those I'd often find in his weird bags. Before reading, he turned to me and smiled. "You're going to love this." He looked back to the pages and began reading off the contents. It registered like complete gibberish at first, before I realized that he was reading, or actually butchering reading off another language. I don't know if it was Latin or Italian or fucking Klingon. He stuttered over some words, mispronounced others several times before either feeling content that he'd pronounced it correctly, or otherwise assuming it was close enough, and moving on to the next word. If I hadn't been so frightened for my life, I would have found this grating and annoying. Despite the lack of grace, whatever he was saying was doing something for sure. I felt the bed start to shake under me. The bulb of the center of the lamp began flickering. From nowhere, a circling wind picked up within the room and I could smell something much more rotten above the blood on my face or the soaked animal remains in the center of the room. I could no longer hold my stomach, and threw up bile onto the mattress under my head. Kyle didn't notice as he continued to stumble over words, speaking faster now and no longer stopping to correct his jumbled reading and mispronunciations. It suddenly seemed like the room itself was occupied by a darkness. I felt like a billion eyes were on me, Kyle and the whole room. He paused his chanting and began to laugh wildly. "Yes, here it comes. He's really coming. He's finally going to make you love me." He cheered for a moment before turning his attention back to the book and resuming. The darkness started to make a centralized form, which was genuinely just a towering pillar of concentrated blackness. Somewhere from within, red light burned inside, which was the only thing that separated its shape from the rest of the enclosing darkness. Soon the light of the lamp reflected off of nothing except the bed, myself, and Kyle, who looked at the being with excitement and wonder. He spoke, but it sounded much quieter than before, the sound being almost eaten by the darkness around us. "I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you came to me." No sound came from the pillar at first. It instead moved forward towards the pile of gore. The darkness of its body moved over top of the remains, and the red light glowed brighter from within for a moment. It moved backwards to its previous position, and the red light inside of it darkened a little after a moment. The gore had disappeared, and every drop of blood was now cleaned from where it sat. Kyle saw the overwhelming silence as a chance to speak again. "I beg that you consider my wish. I seek love, but she won't be with me." He gestured to me. "I don't need her soul as long as she can't fight my love. Please make it happen." A high tone screamed from the pillar and pierced through my ears into my brain. Words, almost like my own organic thought, entered my brain. The voice was stern, deep, and emotionless.
"Bumbling fool, we are no slave of yours. Disrespect is not tolerated."
Kyle clearly received the words directed at him and fell to his knees. "No, it's not fair. I brought you here. I control you. You will listen to me." The responding tone was higher this time, but the voice penetrating my mind was still calm and unaffected.
"You have shamed us enough."
Before Kyle could react, the pillar began to glow red through the blackness of its shape more now than ever before as it swiftly floated forward and over his entire being. The room felt completely still, and no more noise came from its shape. Moments passed as it didn't move, but I started to notice that the darkness surrounding the room itself began to dissipate a bit. It was then that the darkness of the pillar's form turned red and mist-like. The air within the room itself became filled with the moisture before the figure started to dissolve, leaving no trace of Kyle. The room was empty and quiet, as normal as it had been before, although a moisture still hung thick in the air. At this point, I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. Shock had overcome me and I was far too busy running through a billion questions inside of my head to even consider my originally underestimated predicament. However, not too long afterwards, I heard voices coming from somewhere outside of the house I was being kept in. I started screaming as loudly as I possibly could until I heard the crash of the door being broken down. Obviously, due to a year's almost non-stop stalking, the police and my family had a pretty good idea of who to look into as soon as I didn't return home from work. Kyle's mother gave him away pretty quickly, telling the police that she'd kicked him out a few years before and he'd moved into a small house his grandparents had left him. She also said that he'd been doing devil worshipper shit in their basement, being the main reason she decided to kick him out. She didn't initially say anything about these interests the few times police did take my stalking case seriously enough to question her. "Look, I was already known as the Stalker kid's mom. I didn't need the extra label of crazy Satanists added on," she said. "This is a strongly Christian household." I couldn't even speak after being untied and removed from the room. I didn't start speaking until I was hooked up to sedatives at the hospital. Still, I was both horribly afraid of looking crazy myself, and also afraid of what might come after me if I told the truth. Instead, I decided to test the real story out on my mother in private, who believed me but begged me not to tell the police or doctors. She said it was beyond anything they can understand or help. So we ultimately fabricated a story that I woke up in the house alone just before the police arrived. Since then, Kyle has been marked as wanted and on the run. It's been quite some time since, and my life has actually gotten better. In fact, it's been extremely lucky, more so than ever in my life. I finally was able to obtain a job in my ridiculously elusive field, and left the mall shoe store behind me. I also met the love of my life, which was coincidentally my biggest crush from junior high, who moved away when we were kids but came back a few months after my abduction, when her job surprised her with a promotion that moved her there. Despite this, I still have nightmares. Not of Kyle. I know for a fact he's never coming back. I just can't get the pillar out of my mind. I don't think it would ever come back for me. In fact, I felt like a bug on the cosmic scale in comparison to that thing. but I can't shake the feeling that I saw something people aren't supposed to see. And I fear the more I talk about it, the more I risk my own life and soul.